Welcome to On the Bubble Podcast, episode 66. I'm your host, Sabasa J. Wada, and with me is my co-host, Yuki Lee Bender. Today, we're going to be doing a Heavy Hitters retrospective episode, reflecting back on heavy hitters for the season and turning our year into part the Mistveil, starting in a couple of weeks when the spoilers start to come out. But before we do that, how was your week, Yuki?
My week's been pretty good. Mostly been doing non-flesh and blood stuff. I feel like I was sick for a while, finally recovered. I've been trying to actually buy things for the place I moved into that I was missing. I didn't have laundry baskets, for example, because I had shared ones before, and then I was just oh, I should probably get those. So I just been taking care of lots of odds and ends. Girlfriend is visiting from out of town. She got on Monday. We went to Armory last night and did a heavy hitters draft, which was fun. Yeah, that's about it. It's been pretty good, pretty laid back. Looking forward to PQs next week. I think we're gonna road trip down to Tacoma and then Portland to catch PQs on, I guess it would be Saturday, Sunday, and then we have I think 3 or so local ones on the next 2 weeks. So that should be pretty good. I'm gonna be playing I think 5 PQs total, and it's more than I've played in a while, and I'm kind of excited about it. We also have a new metagame shaping up with Dromai leaving soon, which we talked about on last week's episode. But yeah, pretty exciting PQ season overall, I think.
Do you know what you're going to play for week 1 at least?
I'm probably just going to play KO week 1. The meta is still the PT meta. It's the deck I have the most reps on. For week 2 and beyond, I could see myself playing a whole bunch of stuff, honestly. I might check out Brody's Azalea list that he won the Calling Phuket with just this most recent weekend. Congrats to Brody. Longtime Azalea player. The list looks quite interesting. He's playing basically no blues. I think he's playing 3 Knock the Death Whistles, and the rest is just yellows and reds. And he's actually playing one of our spoiler cards, Amplifying Arrow. I guess because the deck is essentially the yellows are the resources cards, which was already the case for Azalea, but he just really leaned into it. And then I think because of that, he gets to run even more pumps and stuff. So Amplifying Arrow actually ends up being kind of an interesting card. And I wonder if it helps with the Guardian matchup where you can get to an end game where you have a bunch of pumps and an Amplifying Arrow and can just do a huge dominate to close out the game versus the D-React heavy decks. So that's something I'm looking at. Might look at Bolton. Bolton looks kind of interesting. Ellie likes Bolton a lot, has been working on that deck, so I might try something out there, but I'm not totally sure. So I don't know. There's a few things I'm interested in. I might even play Dash, honestly. Dash isn't the most exciting to me, but I think Dash might be pretty good. Dromai leaving, one of her worst matchups gone. She's already been doing pretty well. Dash could be pretty well positioned. So there's a lot of stuff that I could see myself playing, and it will just I'll probably do some testing and figure out what I want to play. Yeah, what about you, Jay? How's your week been, and what do you think you're going to be playing at PQs? Are you sticking with Pistol Dash?
PQ season, I don't think I'm going to go next week, so I'm going to start from the second week of PQ. I'm most likely playing Dash. I don't know which Dash yet. I'm wanting to somewhat play Boost Dash a little bit. What is that card called? Maximum Velocity. That's what it was. Yeah, I just want to somewhat Maximum Velocity people from contrast to my usual playing unmovable Sync Belows and Fate Foreseens. I kind of just want to see people's reaction to me just boosting 3 times in one turn, catch them off guard a little bit.
That does sound pretty funny, honestly. I would be surprised. Even you just mentioning it here is surprising. But also, I know a bunch of our locals listen to the podcast, so maybe Jay's psyoping our locals. Who knows?
Oh, yeah, so they're round 1, I'm going to show Dash, and they're going to expect Teklo Pounder as their item, and they still go, I was too lazy to put this deck together, so I'm still playing Slab Dash.
Sounds distinctly possible. I'm very curious to see how that all shakes out. I feel even if you do play Teklo Pounder Dash, you're going to play it once, and you're going to be I just want to block, and then go back to Slab Dash. I could be wrong, but I feel I haven't seen you really play an aggro deck in Fab since Chain and Briar days when they were just clearly best deck. And since then you've been Starvo, Oldham, Dash, specifically Pistol Dash.
Yeah, there was a time I played Fi, and that couple of weeks kind of scarred me playing Fi. It's lost a couple of die rolls at a PQ, and then my opponent like double art award me on one of the turns, and I was like, how is my Fi deck even playable? My hand blocked for 8. It was like the same scenario where if my hand blocked for 12, I would have won the game, or if my hand blocked for like 14, I would have destroyed the game. I was like, I'm gonna play 4 blocks again. And Guardian's the only deck that plays 4 blocks.
That's fair. Blocking is pretty good in Flesh and Blood, it turns out. I feel
Yeah,
like there's like a long history of decks that block really well, doing pretty well. Not to say like other decks haven't been successful, but the kind of like more defensive attrition style decks have just been pretty reliable and pretty constant through like almost every metagame.
no, do you know the reason why I like these big block decks is because I really like 0 for 4s. Ever since like the Cheerios Briar deck like disappeared from existence, there was no ways to get 0 for 4s like 4 cards. Like I couldn't do a 4 card 16 for no reason anymore. So the only way to do a 4 card 16 now is to block for 4 times.
That's true.
Yeah,
KO
so
can do 4 card 16s sometimes.
yeah, but it's so much harder, like you gotta put together 2 costs and like go again somehow. Agility token too hard to make. I just wanna be a consistent, like 13 is fine, block for 9 and then a 4 block. That's perfect.
Yeah, I get that for sure. The modularity of your hands where just like everything is worth 4 is like pretty sweet.
Yeah, consistency is king. Consistency is king.
All right, I think we can move on. Just quick shout out to our Patreon. Once again, thank you so much to all of our patrons and everybody who contribute. Also, thank you to the Discord. We have a lot of awesome questions there, a lot of awesome discussion about both draft and CC. I think these days with the PQ season coming around, it's a little more CC focused, but especially in the early days of Heavy Hitters, there was a lot of people posting draft decks, talking about it, and lots of great discussion there. And yeah, we just appreciate all of you so much, and we appreciate all of our listeners who aren't able to give back as well. So thank you for tuning in, and thank you for supporting us. Speaking of the Patreon, though, we do have a patron questions channel on the Patreon where people can submit questions to be discussed on the show. And this week we have a question from Malzenith Yichin, friend of the pod. And he asks us, one thing that Brian Gottlieb touched on in his most recent interview with Dice Commando is the high level reception of Heavy Hitters being worse than Evo overall, which is a stark contrast to Evo as Bright Lights versus Heavy Hitters at the average player level. Why do you think Heavy Hitters did well, and what issues did Heavy Hitters have as you drafted it more? What do you think of the format overall? And he says he's basically asking us to record a retrospective episode, which is exactly what we're doing this episode. So we're going to kind of start off with Yichin's question, and then kind of go into a little bit of a retrospective of the set, and kind of talk about our thoughts on the format now that we've drafted it more and kind of as it's phasing out now.
I feel like by like the general public or like the Twitterverse of Flesh and Blood, I feel like a lot of people enjoyed Heavy Hitters is what it seemed like. And at least for me, I kind of didn't understand that portion. Do you know why the average player liked Heavy Hitters so much?
I think it's like a combination of the gameplay being pretty intuitive. And I think people also felt like between like the different heroes in each class, as well as the hybrid cards, there being like a variety of decks to draft and more varied gameplay than some of the sets, like in contrast to like, let's say like Uprising, where like your Phi decks kind of all look the same, your Icelander decks kind of all look the same, your Dromai decks kind of all look the same. Heavy Hitters was not that. Heavy Hitters had like variety both within the class with your different heroes, as well as even sometimes that class had different archetypes or different ways of being drafted. And I think that people overall liked the mechanics. I think they liked Wager. Some people liked Clash. Yeah, so I think there was like a lot of that. I also just think that the WTR class combination, so Warrior, Brute, Guardian, leads to pretty compelling gameplay. A lot of people liked WTR. We don't have Ninja in this set, but I just think that it's like a lot of pretty like fair vanilla damage, long kind of grindy games. I think that resonates a lot with people. So I think that those were like kind of a lot of the positive points that I heard people talking about, which I agree with and I see, but I think the set also has some drawbacks.
You know what I think is like one of the biggest like upsides for this set compared to some of the other ones is like the lack of arcane damage is I think is a positive in like general gameplay. I feel like arcane damage warps the game in like a very weird way that like requires kind of sideboarding. At least in the current like draft format where we only have like 14 cards per pick of 3 packs, we don't really get sideboard options,
Mm-hmm.
and I think we saw that in like, was it Uprising? It really felt like you were kind of restricted on like how to like handle Icelander's like ability to do arcane damage, and it kind of felt awful whenever you lost your arcane damage.
Yeah, I think that's like the most prominent example because like Icelander could just kind of do, especially if you didn't like, sometimes you just didn't see your arcane barrier piece and you just kind of like, it was kind of like playing against Benji where there's all this unblockable damage, except she can also do it on your turn. So yeah, there were definitely some real non-games. And I feel like even in other sets like Tails, we had like sometimes like people just had like Briar decks and like, yeah, my Briar deck can do like 20 arcane. And you're just like, oh, so you're just gonna like sit here and ping me until I die and you get embodiments and you block real well. Like that's cool, I guess. So yeah, it can be pretty warping.
I guess if it was like we had a little bit easier access to Arcane Barrier without using up some real picks, it might have been like then like I guess the Arcane Wizards get like less playable and like a lot weaker. So like there's like both two sides to this coin, right? Where it's just like if we make it too easy for these arcane barriers to exist, then these classes that like rely on arcane damage kind of start to flop in draft. And then the other side of like, oh, if there's not enough answers, then the decks playing against it just like don't get to do anything, and they just like kind of lose for no reason. And in heavy hitters, with the lack of like arcane damage in general, I feel like gameplay was kind of consistent no matter what, and you always had a chance no matter who you played against.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree with that. I think that arcane damage sometimes leads to real blowouts just like within the draft. Draft is always a little bit like that. Like if you have a really bad deck, you're kind of stuck with it for 3 rounds. With arcane it's sort of amplified because you can have like a pretty playable or solid deck, but then if you just match up against like the heavy arcane damage deck and you don't have AB, it's like all of a sudden like, oh, I can't win even though my deck's pretty good, which definitely a little bit of a feels bad. So I agree with you. Actually, I hadn't really thought about it that way, but I'm curious because I think we will be getting arcane damage again. We might even get a little bit of arcane in part the misfails. Illusionist typically has like a little bit. Yeah, I'll be curious to see how they handle that, and then especially if we revisit like Runeblade or Wizard in the future, which I think we will before too long, probably. Curious to see how that will all get handled.
Yeah, I hope they balanced it better.
So, kind of back to Yichin's question, I think that the lack of arcane damage was something that the set did well. I think there was multiple decks that you could draft, multiple archetypes, which people really liked. But I think that both of us have kind of expressed previously that we're not the most fond of heavy hitters, and I know that some of the players at the PT weren't as well. That being said, it's definitely not everybody. There was a lot of players I met at the PT that just talked about how much they love the set and how they really, really enjoyed this one. So it's definitely not like all high level players didn't like heavy hitters. I don't think that's true, but there were some people that were kind of a little more lukewarm on it. I don't want to speak on other people's behalves, but why do you, or what are some of the drawbacks of heavy hitters in your opinion?
I think I said this like every other week now, but there's too much variance in this set. Not good variance, I think. There's like a lot of feels bad variance in this set. Mostly like wild rides, of draw discarding and then just ending your turn with like cards in hand.
Yep.
Or things like Clash of Agility. Yeah, just Clash in general actually that makes good tokens. And when you're playing a deck that's like quote unquote supposed to win the clashes, and you lose to like a warrior with like a random 7 power in their deck, and they get an agility token. Obviously, the card would be too good if you always got it, but it kind of always feels bad when you lose in spots where you're just like, oh, on average I should win, but this time I didn't. I feel like those spots are kind of really awful. Was there anything else that stood out to you, Yuki?
I'll just say first that like I agree with that. Like I won a PT draft just like off the back of a Clash of Vigor where I won as the warrior against the Guardian. And like, yeah, I took the line where the Clash of Vigor was like my one out to win, and I got it. And like maybe there's some skill expression there, but at the same time, like I just got pretty grossly lucky in a spot that I don't feel like I necessarily deserve to. And I think that's like often kind of the theme with Clash is that even if you can draft your deck to have more control over it, like there's still just like pretty bad variance that happens with it. And the swings can be so dramatic, like they can be completely game deciding. The other thing about heavy hitters that I think is like a positive in some ways and a negative in others is that they kind of dealt with the fatigue issue where like some sets kind of devolved into like playing a lot of 3 blocks and just like sitting there and blocking. And heavy hitters doesn't have that problem. I think that fatigue's in a healthy spot where you can fatigue people, but often you don't. And I think a lot of the way they achieved this was with the low amount of 3 blocks and having a high density of 2 blocks. So that is a positive. The part that I found pretty negative, though, about this, like the flip side of this that I didn't enjoy, was that the 3-for-7s that block 2 were like pretty integral to gameplay, like your wage agilities, your wind ups. All of these cards were just like super premium. We talked about that, like, I think like during our set preview, we talked about how good these cards looked, and they proved to be very good throughout the format. But what kind of ended up happening is it created this problem of like flooding on reds, and like you can always draw all reds in Flesh and Blood, and that feels bad. But boy, does it feel extra bad in this set. And I think it's because they're 2 blocks. So you might draw an all red hand that can function. Your hand might block like 8 or 9, and then you've lost 4 threats from your deck. And even though fatigue doesn't matter that much, when you block with 4 of your best threats, it becomes very easy for you to get fatigued. And that was like even more amplified in Guardian, where you could like play your big bop and you arsenal your nice, like, I don't know, 3-for-7. You have like a wage might in there or something in your arsenal. And then you just draw 3 reds or 4 reds. And you're just like, well, I spent my whole last turn setting up an aura. I need to play this, but I don't have the resource card. And you just kind of instantly lose on the spot. And I feel like drawing all reds can always be game losing. That's part of Flesh and Blood. We're playing a card game. That's fine. But it just feels extra punishing in this set, like more so than any other set I can think of or any other format I've ever played. It feels so bad about just like drawing all reds, especially with like the 3-cost 2 blocks.
Yes, I agree with you on that. The density of 2 blocks makes blocking a lot worse, and yeah, when you can't play cards on your own turn because it's all red, oh man, it's just game deciding. When like if you draw 2 all 4 red hands and if your opponent doesn't, it's like you're never winning that game.
Yeah, it definitely feels pretty terrible. Maybe the last thing I want to touch on with regards to Yichin's question that kind of gets baked in here is in some interviews, I believe it's been mentioned that there's been some desire to increase the variance in Flesh and Blood a little bit. A big appeal of Flesh and Blood is that it is a low variance game that rewards player skill a lot. On the flip side of that, maybe at times it has been a little bit too low variance. We've seen players have like very, very consistent results, a lot of the same names and top 8s. And I think there's been a lot of desire to like open the doors a little bit and make room for players to do well if they've practiced and they've proven that they're some of the strongest players in the game, but also for players to maybe take a little bit more variance heavy deck and still like be able to spike an event or have a good appearance. So with this kind of like general change in philosophy in mind, you kind of touched on it earlier. You said that you feel like the variance in heavy hitters is not necessarily like good variance. What do you think good variance looks like? Are there any examples in this set or other sets that you've seen that you like in terms of variance?
Oh, that's a tough question.
It's a tough one. It's not in our episode notes, so I'm kind of ambushing Jay with this one. I don't even know if I have an answer myself, to be honest, but
I think in general, if I had an answer to this question, I could probably work for LSS and like make a good set. I am not a set designer, so I don't think I have a good answer for this. But I feel like variants that involves like drawing cards is good variants. So things like Tome of Imperial Flame, I think, is a good kind of variance where Dromai got to draw two cards, and they had to pitch the two reds. That was, I think, kind of good variance where it got to spike the power level of Dromai's draws. A little bit too powerful because Dromai was a little bit too powerful, but I think variants like that is typically better where you're trying to like improve your turn. Whereas like things like Wild Ride where it just like bricked your turn and like it just like you just got to do nothing, right? After you missed on the discard on Wild Ride if you didn't have Go Again on it already. So I think punishing variants is not that good. Things like Scab Skin Leathers is like a very common one that like feels really bad to roll a one on. And I think good variants is things like boost, like you boost the top card of your deck, and if it was a, non-mech card, it ends your turn, but it's super easy to mitigate that by just not boosting that often. Or, in our Arcane Rising, we had the, I don't know what that card is called. It's the one where you, like, if you boost it off the top, you get the action point.
Oh, back alley break line.
Yeah, back alley break line. Like, I think those kinds of cards are good,
Mm-hmm.
where it's like, oh, you missed, but then you got something back, and you got rewarded for playing this card that's, like, slightly higher variance. Things like that. Or, like, cards like Ravenous Rabble, I think, is good variance where it doesn't end your turn, it doesn't break your turn, but your damage output got smaller.
Yeah, I think I agree with all of that. I think it really comes down to like how big of a swing it is, and when the swing is too large, it tends to feel worse. So I like the example of like Wild Ride, your turn ending, Scabskin's Leather, your turn just ending, and you go from like a winning or even position to just like a completely game losing position. I understand that like sometimes like you can make an argument, oh, like anytime you go up or down like 1 or 2 points that can completely shift the game, but I just think that like a lot of these outcomes are so big that you can be like considerably ahead and still just like suddenly start losing from it. I think kind of I agree with you that like drawing cards is good. Like one of the things I enjoyed most about this set was the gold and some of the interactions with gold and clash where you could like get some info at the top of your deck and try to improve your hand. You could also try and gamble based on what's left on your deck. It also created like neat pitch stacking puzzles. So I really like gold as like a hand smoothing thing that also had some variance. Like sometimes you had lines where you're like, do I gamble on the gold and hope that I draw a blue? I think I have to. And that's like an informed decision that you can make, but you're never like priced into taking that risk. And it's always like a calculated risk. And typically most of the time you can kind of smooth things out so that you can kind of like manage the level of the risk. You can often set it up so that you have a play. If you brick, it's just not as good of a play, which I think is kind of like the key. And I think when the variance is just like the difference between the good and the bad outcome is too big, it starts to feel like like the whole game hinged on the Scabskin's die roll. Or we even saw this in the top 8 of the Pro Tour that like some games I think were pretty decided by KOs just drawing Blood Rush Bellows and discarding it off the top with their Wild Ride with like multiple cards in hand, and they just lost in CC. And yes, there's deck building. Yes, there's things you can do to control it. Yes, it's very low likelihood, but it definitely creates pretty big feel bats. So I don't think it's like you can have draw discard effects, but maybe Wild Ride is like a particularly frustrating version of it. Like I've always found like Bear Fangs to be like the less frustrating card in draft in CC because like, yeah, you missed the +2 and the might token. That feels kind of bad, but like you played a 2 for 6. That's okay. You're fine. You know what I mean? But then like if you I don't know. It's like so different than Wild Ride where you just like lose the Go Again and you kept a bunch of cards so you can't convert and it's just awful.
Yeah, I think it just depends on like what you're getting out of it, and what you get out of Wild Ride is the Go Again, which means you want to play one more thing. You losing that one more thing can be like, 6 damage, 8 damage, 5 damage, and that's just a lot more than when Bear Fangs misses, where you're only missing out on 2 damage, right? Like
Yeah.
just looking at the card itself.
Yeah, and I think you kind of see that if you've been listening to us over the weeks with our discussion of Clash, how our favorite clashes were the ones like, you know, Test of Strength, where you're clashing for a gold, and then like maybe after that is like Vigor, and after that is Might, and the one we were the least fond of was Agility. And again, it's that same idea that as the stakes get higher, it starts to become a little too much. Like I'm okay like losing a clash and having that have an impact on the game, and sometimes you lose like 5 clashes, and that's just like how the game goes. But I think that like sometimes just like an individual instance of like I lost 1 clash of Agility, and then my opponent got to convert their next 4 card hand, and I was just like completely buried. Like that feels pretty bad. And yeah, hopefully they can kind of find a middle ground where there is some of this variance that I think people do enjoy without it being completely game deciding all on its own.
I'm all in for fun variants,
Mm-hmm.
but ones that feels bad too much and it doesn't feel rewarding enough is not it. It's not it.
All right. So I think that's pretty much going to wrap up Yichin's question about heavy hitters. I guess we could compare a little bit to Evo. I think we both liked Evo more. What was it about Evo or Bright Lights that you enjoyed more?
Biggest take on Evo is that it was like on one of the highest skill expression set of kind of all time, I
Mm-hmm.
think. At least in the draft section and in not in like the actual gameplay. The gameplay was kind of dull and not that interesting to be honest, because so many other cards did the same thing and all the games kind of like devolved to being the same kind of game.
Mm-hmm.
At least in the draft section, you got to express the most amount of skill in I think any of the sets so far, because you got to stay quote unquote open and like pivot, decide on what cards to pick, what cards to prioritize, and all of those decisions were like really impactful on the results of your game,
Mm-hmm.
mostly for like Dash IO and Max.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like the general population, or like at least what I saw on like Twitter and stuff, people didn't like Evo. And feel like that's because they weren't either trying to draft Max or Dash IO, or like they like, quickly decided that that wasn't the deck for them. So when you are only doing one thing in Evo, it kind of sucks. Which if you're just only picking up 3 blocks and always playing Teklo, yeah, obviously it's gonna suck because there's almost no skill expression. You're just drafting 3 blocks and good cards. I feel like that was the floor of that format. The goal of that format was to beat the Teklo that was doing that and be better than do something more powerful than what Teklo can do. And it's not always that easy, right? Like that was a go-to strategy because it was strong. As really strong drafters, what you're trying to do is like to somehow beat that strong strategy. And I kind of really like that line of like, oh, where do I pick this item? Do I try and wheel this item because I still do need like a 3 block boost card because they're just like so good. And it also takes it away from the Teklo, and the Teklo is not taking the item because it's bad in their deck. Very small decisions like that mattering in the draft section really is what made me enjoy Evo the most.
Yeah, I think I agree with everything that you said there. I actually noticed it coming into heavy hitters. Before the PT, I did a bunch of drafting, and one of my big takeaways, I got some teammates to kind of backseat me and offer some advice. And one of my big takeaways that I was maybe staying a little bit too open. And I think that that was maybe a little bit of bleed over from Bright Lights, where you just had more flexibility. And I know it's something they're trying to work on with the hybrids. I do think it helps. I think there's an improvement there. I think they could improve it a little bit more even. I'm not exactly sure like how, but having more of that feeling of Bright Lights where you could draft a card and it's playable in any deck, but it's synergized in certain decks was really interesting. The decks also felt very like, especially Max and Dash felt very synergy focused. Like you really needed the right mix of cards. And it felt like when you had the right mix of cards, your deck really came together and was like greater than the sum of its parts. And when you didn't have the right mix of cards, it kind of like didn't really work out. And then Teklo was kind of the like, you just play good cards and the quality of your cards get you there. But it was nice to have like all of those things expressed. Whereas I think maybe all formats that I've drafted, at least like regular formats, like Cube gets a little bit different, but like in regular draft sets, usually it's more card quality focused. And I think even Bright Lights is kind of like that. There's not that much synergy. It's more like you want like the right ratios of cards, and then you kind of like do your efficient play and hit people. You don't have these like, you know what I mean? Like I feel like Max was a lot of like you're like setting up to do your like big shot turn, and you need to make sure that your curve works like that, works well with that, and you need to make sure that you have like some items to go over Tekla-Boston, for example. And like there was just like a lot of like pieces that you needed to combine and get into the same hand and kind of like manufacture these very particular game states that were really powerful. And that was kind of how you won. And that felt, I think that for a lot of people, that might have been like too far in that direction and a little bit hard to approach, but it was very, I think for us, it was very like interesting and rewarding. So maybe there's some kind of balance between those two polar ends.
Yeah. I feel like Evo was a set that like kind of rewarded you for doing like the 15th, 16th draft.
Mm-hmm.
And then like Evo kind of was unplayable for the first 5 drafts. Like it's once like your dash deck and your max deck just fell apart so fast. And if it's like your first or second dash draft or like your 4th max draft, no way you're getting something good together, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like it's like almost impossible.
Yeah. And I definitely remember having that learning curve early on of like, everybody thinks Max sucks. I'm going to draft this deck like 10 times and see if I can figure out if there's something there or not. And in the end, it was like, oh, yeah, there is. And that was like very rewarding. It's possible that like maybe it shouldn't be quite so extreme. Like people's, because like a lot of the people won't even draft 10 times. So having the first 10 drafts feel bad is like probably not very friendly for a lot of players.
Yeah, that's their whole draft experience.
Exactly. Yeah. So I think that's a lot of why people didn't like that set. And I think Heavy Hitters is like almost the exact opposite, right? Like your cards are so vanilla, so like fab fundamentals, play good cards that everybody could kind of pick it up and play. So it's nice to have that. And I wonder if they can kind of include some of the like archetypes and depth that Bright Lights had in their next sets.
Yeah, we'll see. Honestly, part of the Misveil looks like there's a lot more complex cards. I feel like that's the best way of saying it. There's like a lot of like do very little and has a lot of moving parts kind of cards. So it might be more similar to Evo than Heavy Hitters, but you know, hard to say without much of the spoilers out yet.
Yeah, definitely curious to see how it goes. I agree. Some of those like blue non-blocks do nothing unless you've played a blue cards are like pretty synergistic and interesting. And you're right, it is kind of like Bright Lights where you had like, you know, your boom grenades, which could, if you had the right setup for your boom grenade, it was like a 4-for-0 that gave you a free weapon attack for 2 and like maybe an action point. Other times it just didn't do anything. So yeah. Like again, it doesn't have to be that extreme, but I think rewarding that setup is really cool, and I hope that we see that in Part the Misfail, and I kind of think we will.
Let's move on to just our heavy hitter retrospective. So we're just gonna like go past, and I feel like this. Hopefully, this is a section where people can like come back to if they're ever doing like a draft, coming back to this set. That's the hope, at least. I guess let's start with the class power rankings. Which class do you think was the most powerful class in heavy hitters?
I think it ended up being Warrior, then Brute, then Guardian, but I think that Brute and Guardian are relatively close for me. But I think Warrior did end up being the best by a bit, which I don't think either of us really expected early on, because like the rate on the cards is bad, but the reactions are just so good.
Being able to force an end game where both players at like 2 life is like so warrior flavored that it's like not a hard spot to get into to like keep the game close. So yeah, I think warrior did end up being the best class in the set, but I think more than that, the most underdrafted decks seem to be the most powerful in each pod.
Yeah, so I think that's a really good point. And I heard some very high level players say this, that they just didn't want to be the 4th of whatever class, and that was like their draft strategy. So I think that even though Warrior is the strongest class and some people did force Warrior, I think that Heavy Hitters was a set that if you could be the 2nd of the class, you got really, really paid out for it. So the difference in power level between the classes isn't so big, but I do think Warrior was the best by a little bit. And we kind of saw that in the ProQuest season that Warrior had the most wins. I think Kasai was the most winning deck across ProQuests.
Yes, it definitely was. It wasn't close.
So that takes us to our best heroes. Kasai, of course. Any other heroes that stood out to you?
KO was very strong. KO just had good numbers because of its might tokens. Or as long as you got to generate might tokens, KO was very powerful.
Yeah, and I think the two classes that had agility, so like Warrior and Brute, ended up being very strong.
And then for Guardian, it's gonna have to go to Betsy. Victor was kind of too inconsistent to put together. When Victor came together, he was kind of like the most powerful Guardian, but that just wasn't the case a lot of the times. You're fighting for Testa's strengths a lot. That was like the main card you wanted to make that deck very powerful. And because it's like a generic 4 block, almost all the heroes wanted it. It was kind of hard to get like 3+ copies of this card.
Yeah, I definitely agree that for Guardian, Betsy just ended up being the better pick the majority of the time. We'll talk about it later, but I was very high on Victor at the start, and as the format evolved, I got to be fairly low on him. So yeah, that was like a bit of a shift, and it was sort of interesting that each of the classes had like one option that seemed to be the better option. I wonder if this is going to be a trend. I guess in like Outsiders, we saw some variety of decks that did well, but I think we both ended up feeling like Katsu was the better ninja. Azalea was often the better ranger. So I feel like this is like something that's like hard to solve for Flesh and Blood draft, and I hope that they're able to kind of find a way to avoid that. But it is hard when they share a card pool. Like one deck will often just come together more often.
Yeah, well, I think it's just like a power level question, right? It's like which hero, if they're both from the same class, is like which one is just like more consistent or more powerful, or which hero ability is more impactful. And just a lot of the times, there's gonna be one that's gonna be slightly better than the other one, depending on the card pool we get access to. And Betsy's ability was just a little bit more relevant. Like Victor Goldbane is like definitely more powerful as his ability because we see that in CC. Like we don't see Betsy's in CC, but we see Victor's. So Victor is the more powerful ability. It's just that it's so much harder to trigger and to convert in draft that Betsy's hero ability is just more relevant in draft. So it's gonna be hard to have this balance just in Flesh and Blood's current design. So I feel like this trend is gonna continue if we're gonna keep having these like 6 hero sets.
Yeah, I think I agree with all of that. All right. Next, favorite class. What was your favorite class to draft? You could also add hero if you want.
My favorite class was Guardian.
Mm-hmm.
I felt like if you got together a consistent Guardian deck, it was like you got to block pretty well, you got to attack pretty consistently. The rare equipments were just so powerful that I felt like, Victor with a Golden Glare was so great. Betsy with a Good Time Chapeau was just like so good. When that didn't come together, I kind of hated it, but you know what? When it came together, it felt really strong, so I really liked playing Guardian the best.
I also really like Guardian. I think a big part of it for me was I enjoyed the synergy of Guardian with the tokens. I don't know. I felt like Warrior was a lot of just like, you get agility, you swing your swords, and Brute is a lot of like, I have an agility, so now I can do 2 attacks instead of 1 attack. And the mites just like kind of are like a free roll. Guardian wanted to use the mites to buff up Concuss and what was the other one?
Command
Respect. Yeah, to get really impactful on hits. The Vigors felt particularly good in Guardian too, both because you had 4 costs and because you had like the 1 cost buffs that you wanted to play, and with like in conjunction with a 3 cost. So just like setting up your tokens with your other cards in your deck felt really interesting and very cool, and it was like one of the most like synergy focused decks in the format, I think, and I think that's why I enjoyed the gameplay of it. I do agree that it was sort of like the hardest to come together and have a good version of, and the most prone to being overdrafted.
Yes. Let's move on. Any unplayable heroes? I guess we already touched this, but I don't think any of the heroes were unplayable, but the three heroes of like the three of the weaker side of the heroes were just like I kind of won't recommend a newer player to ever play it. Like I don't think if it's like your first heavy hitter draft, you should draft Reiner ever. I don't think you should draft Victor. I don't think you should draft Olympia if it's your first 2-3 drafts. Just stay away from them. They're not worth it. You're just gonna have like a worse time because you're never going to be able to trigger their hero ability, or if you just draft the other side, you'll just have a better draft experience, I think.
I think I agree with that. I think Olympia of the three of those is the one that I have the most confidence in, like being able to offer something. And maybe Victor if you have the Nuts Victor deck. But Victor was like very hard to come together, and Reiner hard to come together, and it felt like even when it did come together, it wasn't really all that good. I never really saw like the super good Reiner deck, and even when I play people who had the super good Reiner deck, sometimes I just beat them anyways because they just like didn't line up their big intimidate claw pack hunt turn the way that they wanted it to, and then they just kind of lost because they're below rate. So I think that deck had some like real problems.
Yeah, I feel like Reiner may have been like the only unplayable hero where, don't get me wrong, I've seen and got destroyed by like a couple of Reinars that are like really well built, but I feel like a lot of those times were like off of like them having like more than their share of their 3 blocks. Like, I played against a Reiner deck that had like 26 3 blocks near the beginning of the format, and I'm like, I don't know how anything can beat this deck. Like, it's just the stone wall, and they just find their 5-card hand that like intimidates twice, and you just can never win against them. But like, if they actually had to play 2 blocks, then the game kind of wouldn't have been close. So yeah, it shows that like in Flesh and Blood, like the raw card advantage that you get just from playing good cards is like pretty hard to overcome. I feel like when Reinhardt decks come together, it's typically just like the raw card quality is so good for them.
I also think there's a lot of Reiner decks that do well, but could just be good KO decks.
Yeah, I agree with you on that. Then I guess the next question would be favorite card of the set? What was your favorite card of the set?
So I don't think there were any cards in this set that I was like, wow, this card is so sweet. Which is like maybe another reason I wasn't so keen on this set. I feel like other sets there were cards where I was like, yeah, I love this card. In this set, I was like, there's a lot of okay cards. I think my favorites were Clash of Might and Clash of Vigor because the clash effect on them wasn't too big. You could sometimes use them for info on the top of your deck, which felt relevant. And I liked the 2 costs. I ended up liking the 2 costs a lot, both to mitigate the red flood that we talked about earlier. So you could like pitch yellows to play them and not get destroyed, as well as they comboed really nicely with like the lead withs or money where your mouth is. So you could play like 1 cost buff into the 2 cost, and all of that felt really good. So I really like these like clash cards, especially the non-agility ones, because the agility, like sometimes when you block with it, it just loses you the game. But the mights and the vigors were like nice, and I found myself picking them pretty aggressively and really kind of liking the 2 costs. So much so that like I was often trying to pick up a few of those 2 costs, and sometimes even picking up some of the like rising energy type cards because of the 2 cost stat line. I liked having a few of those.
That's fair. That's fair. Yeah, those cards were just like on rate everywhere, so like it was kind of nice.
Did you have any favorite cards of the set?
Yeah, my favorite card is Concuss. That card was like hard to play around. So like your opponent couldn't play around Concuss. Like it was kind of impossible to. And when you got together like or chained together like 2 to 3 concusses every turn with like a Leadamite, it was kind of backbreaking, and it felt like the strongest combo thing you can do in Guardian. It was like my favorite thing to do as a Guardian is just like 7 concuss, 7 concuss, 7 concuss, and they're just like, I don't get a turn, and then they don't have any more cards left in their deck.
Yeah, I agree. I also considered picking Concuss. Concuss was really sweet. I actually felt like one of my favorite ways to draft Guardian was like with the concusses, with the 1 cost buffs and some vigors, and also with the clashes, so that like sometimes you could play the buff with the 2 cost and you had like the flexibility to do either. So kind of all fit into the same deck.
Yeah, I feel like the synergy of Guardian came from Concuss. So I think that's my favorite card of the set. Number 1 common is for me is Concuss, is like Red concuss is exactly what I'm looking for. Yellow concusses, I'm kind of sad, but you know what? If I can buff it, it's still good.
Moving on here, how important did you end up feeling equipment was in this set? So like, where are you usually picking it, and which pieces are you prioritizing, if any?
I think equipment in general was not important in this set because there were like an abundance of them, and you almost always got a piece somewhere in the draft when you weren't looking for like in deck card. So I don't think you had to prioritize any of the equipment. The one exception would be the rare specialization headpieces. Those were premium because they were so much better than the other equipments in the set. And the headpieces of the set, the generic ones, were kind of bad. So if you saw specialization, they were kind of irreplaceable. You kind of definitely needed to, like, if you saw one, you should have played it. Mostly Knucklehead. That card was that card was beyond any other card in the set. I think it's just like it just did so much.
Yeah, yeah, I think I agree with that. And I also think that the token makers and like raw meat were like also very strong. But I agree with you that the gap between them and the other pieces were not so huge. So often just having like the adversity pieces in those slots was like fine and sometimes even better. So it was interesting. I felt like having a piece of equipment in all your slots or like all but one slot was like pretty important to having a good deck. But it didn't necessarily have to be like super specific ones. I think the token makers and the specialization hats were like probably the best though.
I feel like equipment isn't as important in this set as other sets.
I think I would actually agree with you. I was picking equipment pretty highly, and I think that was another thing that shifted for me in PT prep was that it's still a high pick, still important, maybe not quite as high as some other sets. Especially like early in the draft. As you get later into the draft, if you know you're lacking equipment, you can move it up in your pick order. But if it's like early and there's some premium cards, you can take the premium cards over the equipment a lot of the time.
Okay, let's move on and talk about this one. Top 3 commons to pick one, pack one.
So I think that the best common in the set is just Wage Agility Red. That card demands so much tempo, and often not so much against Warrior, but against Brood and Guardian, you can often just like play it in a spot where even if they block it out, they can't make use of the agility properly, and that's really powerful. And then it's like also super good in Warriors where they can use like the attack reaction to push it over. So I think Wage Agility Red is like probably my strongest common in the set. What did you have as your top common?
My top common is I see your list right now. It's Flat Trackers.
Okay.
That was my top common. I think that card was just like the most flexible. Oh, we forgot to mention this in the equipment just now, but yeah, Flat Trackers was definitely one of the strongest cards in the set. The on-demand agility when you know you wanted to, play 2 cards on the next turn with your arsenal card. Flat Trackers was the thing that let you converted really awkward 2-block hands and into like a 14 damage turn, and that's just really not fair, right? Like you were gonna do 7 and block for like 11 like it turns your 11 damage turns into a 14 damage turn. If you can do something like that, it's just like beyond, it's like significantly above rate that it's
Mm-hmm.
I feel like Flat Trackers was the card that like let you fix your hands and boards that was irreparable with any other card in the game in the set, essentially.
I agree. Flat Trackers was really strong. I had it as my third strongest, but I think that like the 1, 2, and 3 are all very close. One of the things I liked about Flat Trackers the most is like sometimes in spots, like if you had an agility token and you could send a big attack, you could like wait to see if they block. And if they block, you can be like, oh, so you're committing cards, you can't hit me that hard. I'm going to cash in my Flat Trackers, get another agility token, hit you again, and then like I'm going to have the agility to hit you again on the following turn, and you don't have that bigger return. And that was like really powerful. So I found like it's a card that you have to like plan when you use it, because sometimes if you like break your Flat Trackers and they push lethal and you have to give your whole like most of your hand and you can't use it, like that's kind of game losing. But yeah, you can also just use it as a 1 block, which is like still good. And I agree, the flexibility of the card's like super strong.
I did just realize the second card that I had in mind is not a common.
Yeah.
I don't have a second card now.
What was it, out of curiosity?
It was down but not out.
That is a very good card, yeah, but not a common.
That is definitely not a common, but yeah, it's down but not out was a super powerful card that like just won games in one way or another and really demanded like how games were played warped. Like games were warped for this card, I think. If you had the luxury of playing around down but not out, I feel like you should have, and if you don't, you kind of sometimes lose to down but not out. I had spots where I'm just like, okay, I'm gonna crack my gold so I lose my token, and it's like,
Yeah.
I feel like down but not out was a very powerful card, and when you got to resolve it for like the red one for like 3 4 8 on hit, make agility, might vigor, yeah, nothing comes close to that. Nothing comes close to that.
I did find that like as it got later in the set, especially with high level drafters, they got better at playing around this card, so it wasn't as good as it was early on, but like still very good card. The blue one was good too. It's just like a blue 3 block that can get people sometimes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, or the yellow one.
Yeah, yellow one also fine. My first card was Wage Agility. My third card was Flat Trackers. We talked about those. My second card was Test of Strength. I think in Victor, this card is like pretty crazy, obviously, because it draws you a card when you win the clash. But even outside of that, it's just like a 4 block that you can play in basically every deck. Because like even if you're a warrior and you're bad at clashing, usually giving your opponent the gold isn't like that bad, and you still get a 4 block. So the card's just like super flexible. It's good in every deck, and for that reason, I think it's a pretty good pack one pick one. I think once you know what hero you are, it gets a little bit worse. There's probably like other commons that move up above it, but I think early on in the draft, because of its flexibility, it's like pretty darn strong in my opinion.
Yeah, that's my third pick is Test of Strength as well. All the same reasons. 4 blocks are good in the set, and block cards are good in the set. Test of Strength is great. You kind of aren't unhappy with Test of Strength in any of the decks. Yeah, no, I can't think of a single deck that I'm unhappy with having a Test of Strength in.
Yeah.
It's always solid.
Yeah, the block cards like not turning on the warrior stuff and dealing with like Betsy's overpower was just like super meaningful. I remember playing a game in like draft practice where I think a Betsy had like a 14 overpower, and I just got to go like block with my test of strength, block with like a rally, discard a card, like use some equipment, use my headpiece, and I like actually covered it all up and then like still threw back an attack, and my Betsy opponent was like, wow, like that's insane. And like that's kind of like what the block cards do for you. So like, it has to line up, but I mean it will never line up if it's not in your deck. So
yeah, that's true. That's true. If you don't give yourself a chance to line it up, right? Like it's just having that out is valuable enough.
let's move on then. Biggest traps. This doesn't mean that like you can never play these cards, but maybe cards that are like overrated, or you should like try not to draft too highly or not get baited by. What are some of your biggest traps in this set?
I'm gonna just say the one that I think most of the listeners or usual listeners know. Wild Ride is a trap in the set. The red one is fine. Mostly the yellow and the blue. Oh man, we talked about Wild Rides already this episode, but that card lost me so many games. I like playing that card feels like a trap. The red one is fine. It's fine. Just have to build around it. It's fine. I have to tell myself this too, but the yellow and the blue ones, just don't play it. I don't think it's worth it. The yellow one is underrate and it never blocks. The blue one is really underrate and it never blocks. And if you have to pitch it, it's just gonna kill you on second cycle. I don't think you should ever play Blue Wild Ride.
Yeah, I think Blue Wild Ride's real bad, especially because it's a whiff. I kind of came on our during some of my draft practice before the PT, and then out of Armory last night, I've sort of come around a little bit on Wild Ride. We can talk about that. We're going to talk about changes to our opinions in the draft series. I do think that there's a space for these cards, but I do think that it's not just like, I have a brute deck, so I want Wild Ride. I'm going to slam that in my deck. I don't think that is quite how Wild Ride works. And I think especially the yellows and blues, you should exercise some real caution with. They're a little bit of a liability because you're kind of like forced to play them since they don't block. And yeah, the rate on them is not good unless you can convert a big hand. So Wild Ride, not so good. The next kind of biggest trap that we have are the yellow engagements. So these are like the warrior 1-for-2 attack reactions that give a token and then they block 2. It's just like You don't really want to pitch a yellow. You don't really want to play a 1 for 2, and you don't really want to block 2. So it's just like no matter how you use the card, it's just not that good. And like sometimes having like 1 or 2 of these is like okay if you need your attack reaction count just to like, have an end game, and they're like you can pitch them for an end game, you can saber with them, it's okay. But like you definitely don't want a bunch of these. I sometimes see people like drafting a bunch of attack reactions and they're like, why is my deck bad? It's like, well, you have 5 yellow engagements, and every time you draw those, you're just like being super inefficient. So don't draft too many yellow engagements.
Yeah, I would look to wheel some of the yellow engagements.
Mm-hmm.
Like, if you get them on 14th pick, or like 13th pick, somewhere in that range, great. Like you weren't going to get a good playable anyways on that pick, and yellow engagements are fine there. But, I kind of think a 13th pick card is a trap if you're trying to pick it like 4th or 5th.
Yeah, agree with all of that. Final trap that I have that I've fallen for before, and I've seen other players fall for before, is the Golden Sun, which might sound weird because everyone's like, isn't the Golden Sun insane? It kind of is. I think where I'm at with the Golden Sun is like, if you have a really good Victor deck already with like a bunch of Test of Strength, a bunch of gold generation, the Golden Sun will make your good Victor deck into like an insane one because you just have this like 4 for 10 overpower. I've also seen the flip side though, where you like pick one, pack 1 this card, or like you're drafting a Betsy deck and then you get a Golden Sun pack 3 and you're like, I have to pivot to Victor. And if you like just don't have the support for it, like, and you're starting to play like starting stake to make gold for your for your Golden Sun, like it gets pretty junky pretty fast. It's never like a bad card because like a 4 for 7 yellow block 3 is like still playable in this format, but I just don't think the card is as good as people think it is, especially because it's like such a constructed staple. The card is like good in your good Victor deck, but don't like jump ship off your Betsy deck to play this card. I think that that's like a pretty big trap, and I've seen a lot of people do this, and I've been like, man, I wish I just played Betsy.
Yeah. I would still pick Golden Sun because it's like, what, $6, $5?
That's fair.
Pays for your pack, pays for the pack.
Yeah, if you're drafting for money, you can never go wrong with the Golden Sun.
But yeah, if you try to play it, it's gonna be more mediocre than not. 4 cost 7 is not where you want to be. Like a wage might is just significantly better at that point,
Yeah, you really need like the gold generation from like good cards in multiples in your deck, and then it's like good. But if you don't have that, it's not so good.
I feel like Golden Sun is a card that makes Victor good in Constructed,
Mm-hmm.
and it's like the reason why Victor is so powerful in Constructed is like the Golden Sun. But putting that together in Draft is significantly harder, and relying on a Mythic is not something you should be doing in Draft. So,
especially not one that's like it needs support. I think that's the biggest problem. Is like not only is it like a Majestic, so you can't draft it reliably, but it also needs a bunch of support around it, and you need like all of that to line up. And if you do, the card's really good. So there's definitely spots where like Golden Sun's insane, but just be careful with the card. It's not as good as you think it is, most likely.
Yeah, I feel like the Golden Sun should have been a card that was like that should wheel to like the one of Victor player in the pod,
Mm-hmm.
but that's never gonna happen because it's worth $5.
Yeah, and also people are like, oh my god, it's Golden Sun, I can't pass this.
Yeah, I feel like that's not right.
I don't feel like it's right, but I feel like it does happen.
Yeah, I've seen that before, definitely.
Yeah. The cards that are really powerful in CC, people tend to just like assume are insane in Draft, and not always the case. Often the case, but not always the case.
My favorite card for that, it's not heavy hitters related, but 3 of a Kind. That card is so bad in Draft.
Yeah, that's a really good example. Yeah, that card is real bad in Draft. Even in Cube, it's like, okay. Finally, last kind of point here. What are some changes that we had in our opinions from our How to Draft series? So we kind of talked about each of the classes, how to draft them. And I think for the most part, I agree with what we said, but I do think there are a few key changes from that How to Draft series. I'll start. I think that the no block KO deck is pretty real. Like Bear Fangs, Wild Rides. I played a deck last night at Armory that had like, I think like 8 total of these cards at red and yellow. I ended up playing like 6 blues because I only had 3 blues that weren't whiffs, and I had like 4 non-whiffs in total in my deck, and I was tracking how many I had left and where I'd pitch them, etc., and trying to like block with them. But I think that this is a real deck. It's just that you need very low whiff count for it to actually be consistent. And ideally, you have more than 6 blues, but I just didn't have that many blue 3 for 5s. But it was still very good. I still managed a 3-0. Just like, I don't know, getting to go like Wild Ride into Bare Fangs, 14U, Make a Might is like pretty sick. 2 costs synergize in this deck too, so you have like Pack Hunts and Clash of Mights and Clash of Agilities. That's all really good in this deck. And then because you don't have whiffs, the classers are also like extra good. And I don't think I ever did Wild Ride Claw 2 cost. Pretty hard because you need 2 blues for that, and I had 6 blues in the deck, but I don't think I ever pulled it off, and I still thought that the deck was pretty impressive. So I do think there's a deck here, but kind of back to our previous point, don't put Wild Ride in just like a random brute deck with too many whiffs, because card's pretty punishing. So I think it is a good card, but you need the right deck for it, and you really need like the density of good threats so that you can just like I was basically just sitting there not blocking and then just hitting my opponent for like 15, and you kind of like force them to block, which makes you not need to block that much and kind of makes up for all the no blocks in your deck. But you really need like all the pieces, or else you just like have this deck that's like not explosive enough and also doesn't really block when you have bad hands.
When Wild Ride works, the card is kind of insane. 2 for 6 go again is definitely above rate. So when it works, it's really good. When it fails, oh no.
Yeah, that deck was playing like a lot of yellows and a lot of 2 costs, which like kind of made it work. And I think that might be like a common theme with that deck.
No, that's fair. It's fair. I guess sticking with the brute theme, I guess in our How to Draft series, we were a little bit higher on Reinar and saying that like maybe Reinar might work. But I think both of us agree that Reinar is a little bit worse than we were talking about in that episode. It's kind of funny. Like, we were pretty low on Reinar when we talked about it on our episode.
Yeah, I think we kind of said like don't draft it, but maybe there's something there. And I think our opinion now is largely just don't draft Reiner. I don't know if there's that. Like, if you want to have fun and you want to try and draft Reiner because you think it's enjoyable, go nuts. But if you're trying to like maximize your win percentage, I think it's like almost never going to be right to draft Reiner. I think you should like basically always be KO, which is a little bit unfortunate, but I do think that is like sort of my experience. Some people might have different ones, but I feel like I even just like saw like Reinar's, like people who really like Reinar draft Reinar, and I play against them, and I'm like, okay, this deck's fine. Like, I feel like it could just be KO'd and be scarier.
Well, yeah, it's like it's probably like not that much stronger for it to be Reinar or KO, but like, you know, yeah, I know what you mean. I know what you mean.
Again, with Brute, I feel like early on we kind of talked about the Guardian style Brute deck that plays a bunch of 3 blocks and can just like attrition your opponent out. I think that this deck got harder to draft as the set kind of lived on longer, because people started prioritizing the 3 blocks and you just couldn't get the 3 block density that you needed. So it was really hard to win with these like kind of like pile decks, and you needed something that's like a little bit more synergistic and actually had like a way to like go over and close the game and do like impressive stuff. It felt like you needed to do some above rate stuff on like a turn or 2 in the game to really pull ahead. Otherwise, like, I felt like especially like the Warriors could just kind of exploit you, because like the game's kind of close, and then like your attacks all turn on their sabers and their attack reactions, and you just kind of like get slowly ground out and lose to their attack reactions. So I felt like, especially when you didn't have the 3 block density, that this deck was just kind of, not that you couldn't draft it, but it just got worse and harder to put together as the second went on.
Yeah, like I feel like you wanted like 22 plus 3 blocks, and that was just becoming unrealistic very quickly as the set, as people learn how to draft this set and like prioritize the 3 blocks a little bit higher.
Yeah. We kind of talked the whole time about how good 3 blocks are, but I think as the set went on, it almost became like, if you're deciding between a 2 block and a 3 block, and the 3 block is like a reasonable card, you should probably be taking the 3 block. Like, I was very, very aggressively picking 3 blocks, and I felt like it was super important, because if you like took too many of the 2 block reds and stuff like that, you could just like wind up in a spot where your deck has like 9 3 blocks pretty easily, especially in like the high level pods, and that's really bad. You don't want that.
Your deck, even though your offensive your offense, like your reds and stuff like that, all can be super powerful. But then if you can't back that up by blocking for 6 beforehand, it's not good enough. It just isn't good enough. You're basically devaluing your turn cycle just a little bit too much. Even if you can play like a 3 for 7, it's still better to just like, you know, block 6 and attack for 6 than, you know, attack for 7, block for 4.
Yeah, absolutely. On to other classes. For Guardian, we kind of touched on it. I think Victor's a little worse than we thought initially. Not only because it's like harder to come together and people were prioritizing test of strength, so Victor wasn't just like getting the test of strengths, other people were contesting him for it. But on top of that, I started playing against people who recognize that Victor doesn't have a win condition besides hitting you until you run out of cards. And they would just like fat deck. And I would just like play against these brutes that had like 38 cards in their deck. And I'm like, I can't win. Like I just can't beat this deck. So it just felt like not only was it hard to come together, but there was just like it felt like it also kind of like had the Riptide problem where you needed like 35 plus cards in your deck. And even then, like sometimes like other people could like just also have a bunch of cards and still fatigue you. So that felt a little bit bad. Not everybody was doing this, so I don't think Victor was like necessarily unplayable. But when you were playing in pods where people were actively doing this against you, like it felt pretty awful.
I agree. I've had like a nutted Victor deck with like all the best equipments, and then I was just like, oh, because I had so many equipments, I'm missing cards in my deck. I'm only playing 34 cards and I get fatigued out. And it's just like, Victor's powerful because of his equipment, but then you run out of cards in deck. So it's Victor hard to come together, but when you get to play every card you draft and then have all the equipment, very powerful.
Yeah. Yeah. In a lot of ways, it really does remind me of Riptide, where you need like lots of cards in deck, good card quality, the right pieces, and then you have a good deck. But like the rest of the time, your deck is it's maybe like not as punishing as Victor because like you have a weapon or sorry, as Riptide because you like actually have a weapon and stuff. But yeah, it has like some Riptide vibes to me after playing more.
That's fair. That's fair. And I guess the last class is Warrior. I guess we were a little bit lower on Warrior in our How to Draft series than we thought. So I think Warrior is like a lot better than how we were talking about it in that episode. I don't know what else to say about that. Do you have anything to add?
What I started realizing as other people backseated my drafts, and this was like one of the biggest things that I learned, was that the 1 for 3 pumps on Warrior were actually pretty good. I think I was like underappreciating it a little bit because you're just like, oh, you play like a 2 card 5, like that's not that good. And then if you have the agility, then you have like a 2 card 7, and like then you're like only on rate because the agility. And like that's true on the surface, but a lot of times people are wanting to block to convert their hands, and then you're like getting the plus on the Centauri sabers. A lot of the classes have to block with attack actions, so then you're like often getting the tokens if you're like attack reacting over. And if they block to deny you the wager, which the 1 for 3 pumps give you, and then you attack react over and get the wager plus another token anyways, and like you kind of make up the below rate aspect that you had. And then in combination with that, like Warrior just blocks the best and has attack reactions, so your end game, you're good at getting to your end game, and you have the best end game because you have attack reactions in a set with like almost no D reacts. And all of that just like ended up making Warrior be like kind of insane. Like I just like had like Warriors like sit there and block against me, and then all of a sudden I have like an off turn, and they're like, here is like my pitch stack like 12 damage turn. You're gonna lose now because now you have to start blocking, and I have like 1 attack reaction left in my deck, and I'm just like, oh, like that's bad for me. So it just felt like there was like a lot of ways that Warrior could win, and like you could have some pretty bad Warrior decks that could just like, as long as you had the 3 block count, you could sit there and block and be like, I found the like 4 good cards in my deck, and those 4 good cards are going to let me swing the game in my favor. I actually had this at my PT. I had like a really bad Warrior deck with like 3 starting stakes, and it just didn't matter because I would find a spot to be like wage vigor with go again, wage agility red, and then they block the wage agility red, and then I take the upper handed, and it's just like, okay, I had like a 17 damage turn with like 2 wagers, and then they're low enough that they just lose to my attack reactions. And I felt like that was like kind of a common theme of Warrior, is that like, even though nothing is that above rate, they're like pretty good at staying on rate and just like grinding out little edges. that might be a thing for us to look for later on. Is like value math is important and informs a lot of what's strong in the set, but it's like also not it's also not everything. So maybe you need to pay more attention to the end games and those kind of scenarios, because I think I was like not drafting warrior enough, and I felt like even going into the PT, I wish I was a little more comfortable on warrior than I was, and that was like a big gap for me in my draft prep.
Yeah, it's I guess like analyzing end game states a little bit more and like looking for spots where cards are more powerful than they read, I think is gonna be the thing that we need to improve looking at spoiler season, I think.
Yeah, definitely something to keep an eye out for going forward, especially I think with the new set coming out, which looks to be pretty synergy driven. There could be some kind of like non-value oriented thinking that is pretty important. So keep an eye out for that, and hopefully we can do even better in the next set.
Okay, let's wrap up the episode with the last question. How would you rate the set out of 10?
I think it might be like a 6.5 for me. It is not a bad set. I think it's fairly enjoyable. It doesn't stand out as being especially great for me either, though. It's like not one of my favorite sets.
Yeah, I would rate it very similar. 6, I think 6 out of 10. I don't think I will draft the set after it rotates. Like unless somebody says like, "Oh, I have a box of heavy hitters." Like I'm not going to go out of my way to draft this set again. Where that's not the same for like, WTR I'll draft again. Bright Lights I'll draft again. Tails I don't mind drafting again, but I don't think heavy hitters is going to be a set where I would want to draft again.
I think I agree with all of that. Yeah. I'm pretty happy to be moving on to a new limited format. And some of that might be that like the set didn't click for me the best, I think. Like I think this is the set that I felt the least confident in. I think there was also just like things I didn't like about the set. I don't know if it was necessarily like lack of understanding so much as just like kind of hating Clash, kind of hating the 2 blocks, kind of hating the all reds. Like there was just like a number of ways you just like kind of lost that I didn't really like. And yeah, I think that's kind of really colored my feelings on the set as a whole. All right, that's going to wrap us up. Thank you so much for listening. If you have any questions, feel free to submit them on the Patreon Discord. As we are kind of rounding out the weeks going into Part the Mistveil, we have a lot more time to explore, listener suggested questions or listener suggested episodes like this one, and we love that input from you. And if there is stuff that you'd like to hear us discuss on the podcast, please let us know there. You can also reach out to us on social media. Jay is at UetaJ on Twitter. I'm at Yukili Bender, and we have an email on the bobble at gmail.com where you can contact us directly if you wish. That being said, we're moving into PQ seasons with a pretty big focus on CC, and I imagine we'll touch on that a little bit going forward as well. And I want to wish everyone the best of luck in your pro quests. Hope that those events go well and that you're enjoying the new metagame. Well, I guess we're not there yet, but once we get there, that you enjoy the new metagame. Until next time, thanks for watching and have a good rest of your day.
Do you have anything for a sign off?
Nope. Do you?
Yeah, so I do. I actually got a friend's Yu-Gi-Oh collection. Just like he was like, "Oh, I need to get this out of my room. Please have it." And I was like, "Oh, okay. Like I'll give you some money if I can sell some of the pieces here." And we went through the collection, and there's the OG Dark Magician girl in the collection. Unfortunately, it's damaged and not first edition, so it's not worth like thousands of dollars, but it's still worth a couple of $100. So we got to move that, and I, messaged him be like, "Oh, I found a couple $100. I will send you some money your way." And I thought that was like, it still happens, like like the stories of like, oh, you find a Magic collection somewhere, and like, oh, there's like a couple of $100 cards in here, and it's like worth things. So yeah, I would recommend to still like, if your non-TCG playing friends now have, collections cards from back in the day that they want to like, clean their house. Don't suggest them to throw them away. Just take it off their hand, go through it once, and go through it with a guy who knows that TCG a little bit, and you'll probably find a couple of $100 worth of stuff, even if you think it's completely worthless.
Yeah, it's always really surprising. If you're not so familiar with the game, but there's like a story you trust, you could also go there. Do be a little careful, but there's a lot of trustworthy stores out there that will be honest with you and will treat you well. So if there's a place like that you trust, it's also another place you can go.
Yeah, that's fair. That's fair. Don't get scammed.
Yeah,
That's hard. That's a hard advice to follow. Don't get scammed. But
mm-hmm.
yeah, not getting scammed is very powerful.
That's true.
Yeah, that's all I wanted to say.
Thanks for listening, everyone.
All right. Good night.